This is our last discussion session and an important one. So these days around the world, water is no longer a sectoral issue. It is a test of our ability to manage climate risk, prevent conflict, protect biodiversity, and uphold basic human rights. The science is clear. The data is growing these days. Communities have long held the knowledge needed to manage water sustainably. What has been missing is not the understanding or the knowledge, but it's the accountability and implementation of the policies we have. The 2026 Water Conference comes at a very rare political moment. It's not about setting new aspirations necessarily. It's about deciding whether existing commitments on water will finally be taken seriously, funded, implemented, and measured. This makes the conference a turning point. This time could be different. There is more political willingness, as we've seen also with the government of Senegal as a co-host supporting the organization of the symposium this year, as well as the minister's availability to open the symposium in this morning. So we come to the guiding question of this session. How do we translate scientific, indigenous, and social knowledge into decisions that are implemented, measured, and accountable at the UN Water Conference in 2026? I have 4 wonderful speakers with me today. We will try to make this more of a conversation rather than a discussion panel. And we're looking at to have very concrete and meaningful contributions to the policy dialogues ahead of us in the coming 2 days, but also in the coming year and towards the end of the UN Water Action Decade in 2028 and the conference in 2028. So I will first introduce my wonderful panel. And then we will get to the questions. Sounds good? So first speaker will be Dr. Amélie Petre, who is a senior scientist in hydrology at the French Geological Survey. She is a groundwater scientist focused on addressing groundwater quality and quantity challenges using environmental tracers and groundwater flow modeling. She is also affiliated with the International Association of Hydrologists and has contributed to the policy guidance at the UNEC expert group on transboundary water management. Marie-Amélie agreed to join us today because there was a change in the panel, which is a true spirit of our network and showing up and stepping in when needed. Next speaker is Dr. Yolanda Lopez-Maldonado, one of our council members of our Global Leadership Council. She's an Indigenous Maya woman from Mexico and Earth System scientist. She was recently appointed as lead author of the Indigenous Knowledge and Local Knowledge section of the Global Environment Outlook Report 7 compiled by UNEP, and as a review editor of the second Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystems, IPBES. Thanks for being with us, Yolanda. Next speaker, Dr. Isabela Battistello Espindola, is a senior officer at the International Water Association. She leads the engagement of the young water professionals and regulators communities. She has over 10 years of experience in international relations, sustainable development, youth engagement, international cooperation, human rights, and international, with a focus on water resources. Thanks for being with us. Last but not least, a dear friend, Ms. Prisca Nandede, serves as a senior sociologist with the Ministry of Water and Environment in the Republic of Uganda. She has a background in social sciences with specific interest in gender equality and community development. Prisca is an advocate for improved livelihoods of vulnerable people through provision of sustainable water and environmental services. We're going to have 2 rounds of questions. You'll hear from the whole panel, and then we're going to start over. So I'm going to start with Marie-Amélie. In many transboundary basins, data exists, but it's not shared. From your experience, what is the key political or institutional barrier that prevents data from becoming a shared public good? And how does this undermine trust and cooperation?
Thank you, Sogol. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm filling in for Dr. Florence Adongo, so I'll try my best to add values to this conversation. So yeah, data is sometimes more seen as a strategic asset rather than a shared public good. Collecting data, monitoring groundwater levels or groundwater quality is something that is very expensive. It's a long-term commitment, and it requires, equipment, maintenance, skilled employees to operate this equipment. And sometimes basin authority, different stakeholders or national agencies may fear that data reveal some difficulties or vulnerability between riparian countries, and that might also create or reinforce asymmetry. So even the question of data ownership in transboundary basin, it's really key. I'm going to share my experience studying for almost 10 years a transboundary aquifer between Canada, the province of Alberta, and in the US, in the state of Montana. It's a semi-arid area with almost a century-old dispute over surface water, transboundary surface water. And as a hydrogeologist, I was mostly interested in transboundary groundwater and this aquifer, which is also interacting with this surface water. And so with all the different stakeholders, the first meeting we discussed about conducting a joint assessment with harmonized data on both sides of the border. And the very first question I got was, but who's going to own the data? That's really the big point we need to discuss at first. And yeah, and at first, trust was not there, even though they are friendly neighbors, but still. So, and from my experience also, even when a regional agreement exists, a clear protocol on data sharing or standardization may be lacking. So this undermines trust in several ways. First, when data is withheld, it generates suspicion about the intent of the riparian states, who will assume the worst rather than cooperating on the basis of evidence. And second, without a solid baseline, a common understanding of the resource based on data, on monitoring, well, joint planning and risk management is nearly impossible. So ultimately, trust is built not just on transparency, but also from rules-based data governance. So a way forward is, well, joint monitoring must be jointly performed with, the real-time interpretation, because even when you collect data, and we talked earlier this morning about raw data, well, it needs to be interpreted. We need to understand, like, the common understanding of what the data means, really, and the implications on, well, the decision-making and management. And in regional context, also an obstacle that I've seen from my experience is that preventing data to be accessible or shared, it's the multiple jurisdictional levels. For example, between Canada and the US, we were working within 6 levels of jurisdiction. The counties and the province and the states, and on both sides of the border, each of these stakeholders at different levels, different scales, have been collecting data also. And on both sides of the border, they were not harmonized at all. It's not the same units. It's not the same, geographical system reference. So it's complicated, the notions of scales and jurisdictional levels and the fragmentation of institution. But yeah, overall, joint assessment of water resource, transboundary surface water or groundwater, is a good way at the transboundary scale to build trust. It takes time, but it can work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. Building on trust issues. I'm going to Yolanda. Data often appears neutral, but yet there are all these challenges. Knowledge is known to be power. What is lost when Indigenous knowledge is excluded from water governance? What must this conference do to recognize it as equally valid and actionable?
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to bring a valid but different perspective, which is the perspective of Indigenous peoples. And we all know that there are a lot of projections on water scarcity and security issues. Indigenous knowledge is every day attracting more attention. But the problem has been that Indigenous knowledge has been somehow folklorized, and the sophisticated and precise knowledge of ancient societies, Indigenous communities, has been left behind. And I want to talk about this because this is a very critical point for us, Indigenous peoples, because we really want to bring our knowledge to this type of conversations. So if you go back a few years ago, our voices were non-existent. And now is the time for us to bring this perspective that can help us to all as a society, as a global society, to work together and go hand by hand to solve some of the most pressing water problems. So the question is on building trust and how or what will happen if if Indigenous knowledge is lost or excluded in water governance or in this type of dialogues and negotiations. And first of all, let's wait a few seconds. Okay, I will continue. What we can lose first, Indigenous peoples will lose the remaining amount of knowledge we have, because as you might know, we lost pretty much everything due to historical processes. But this information, which some define as Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, it doesn't matter the definition. For us, this information, this is very critical, accurate, valid, in situ knowledge that can help us to develop solutions together. So for example, excluding Indigenous knowledge from water governance overlooks this very vital knowledge and the sustainable practices as well. For example, how people ascribe meaning to water is very critical for Indigenous peoples, because the majority of Indigenous groups around the world, we give value and a spiritual value to water, for example, but this information is not considered in the majority of those environmental frameworks, for example. So Indigenous Earth observations not only provide very accurate knowledge, but also multi-decadal observation. And the timeline, the time frame we have at this point for the majority of the SDGs, for the majority of the goals, are very short in time. For Indigenous peoples, we see the time longer, and this can also be included, for example, in future models, and we can have robust models for water monitoring or for IPCC scenarios, etc. So all of this leads to anaerobic resilience, a cultural erasure, as science as we know it today ignores all of this information we indigenous peoples can provide. So what can we do for the UN Water Conference? Well, to integrate this information, which is sophisticated and is very complex. We are indigenous scientists working in trying to bring this indigenous science perspective, these indigenous methods, tools, frameworks, and approaches to those dialogues to meaningfully influence the discussions and not being portrayed as tokens that are sitting in a table. So we really want to bring our perspective. And I think this is something that we all together here and in other networks, we can continue in the endeavors and support indigenous peoples in this in our efforts. Yeah, so there is a lot of things to say, but I will give you.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. I will go now to our next speaker. So now we heard about data, we heard about indigenous knowledge, and it seems like we generate more data and science than ever at the moment, yet actions lag. What is missing? Institutional or political link between evidence and decision making? What can this conference do differently to realign incentives so evidence actually shapes into policy? Over to you.
Thank you, Sogol. I would like to start with a simple but a very important statement. Knowledge does not fail. What fails is the institutions that fail to translate it. Across the world, we have been generating scientific data, scientific evidence data, and local knowledge. We do not lack on it. On the contrary, as you mentioned, Sogol, we have extensive information on floods, on climate risks, sanitation gaps, ecosystem vulnerability, and social inequalities. We have this information. And indigenous, gender, youth, and community-based knowledge is consulted, and participatory process, they exist. However, asymmetries in capacity, they are very profound. This can be between countries, institutions, and the stakeholders. Even if we look to the UN SDG data portal, if we look into the 2017 report, what we have is that an average UN member state, they would report only 5 out of the 12 SDG global indicators. And only around like 6%, they have reported on 9 or more indicators. So in this report, what we see is that we have persistent reporting gaps and capacity challenges. And these gaps, they are not only statistical, they signal that we have a weak institutional capacity to understand, to share, and to use the data that is available right now. And these monitoring gaps, they also signal that we have governance issues. My colleague here in the panel mentioned in the beginning that these asymmetries, they are especially visible when we have transboundary water contexts, where data often exist. We have the data being produced, but they are not being shared or exchanged among the key actors that we have. And these limited cooperation arrangements, they can limit how we implement evidence-informed policies, especially about like water flows, lives, and ecosystems across borders. And when data and information, they do not circulate, when this is not being taken into consideration, our decision-making process, our decision-making, it weakens itself. There are 2 critical missing links that I want to highlight to explain this process. First is in terms of capacity, which is supposed by finance, innovation, and also technology. Because many institutions, they like the technical, the financial, and also the digital capacity to generate, to manage, and to distribute the data that they have. Language barriers, they also persist in all of this. And if we aim to enhance this capacity, maybe through like target investments, technology solutions, and institutional learning, it becomes essential to enable more meaningful data sharing and also informated decision making, particularly across borders. But capacity is not alone. The second one, and maybe one of the most important, is this missing link that we have with institutional accountability. We have the evidence, we have the knowledge, but most of the decision-making structures that we have nowadays, they are often not designed to absorb what we have produced. And too often what we see is that science, it remains in reports, in academic papers, in a language that not everyone understands it. And indigenous knowledge, gender perspective, youth data, and social statistics, they can be consulted. Sometimes they are, but they are not systematically embedded in all the final decisions that we have in the process. And all these realities that I mentioned, they are treated more as a background context rather than a driver of policy choices. So the problem is not the lack of knowledge being produced. The problem is the lack of institutional responsibility for acting on knowledge. And this is where the UN Water Conference can intervene and must intervene. The UN Water Conference can act from consultation to decision accountability. We can require that governments, they can not only state that evidence was consulted, but to demonstrate how scientific, indigenous, gender, youth, and social knowledge directly shaped the policies and commitments that they announce in the conference. And these announcements should not be on an access on a report, not just as a narrative justification, not as a tokenism act, just a check in the box, but as part of the decision logic itself. So only when this knowledge begins to be translated is that when we're going to be seeing a lot of evolution in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really do think that institutional capacity building is a topic that we should spend much more time looking into, because a lot of areas that we lack are either because of lack of institutional capacity or because we have institutions that are just not fit for purpose anymore. So I would really like to come back to that in the second round. But going now to dear Prisca, also a Global Leadership Council member of Women in Water Diplomacy Network, but also as a representative of your government. When policies are designed without social insight, they often fail. From a sociological and government perspective, what social reality do water policies most often overlook? How can this conference do it differently?
Thank you, Madam Facilitator. And thank you so much for bringing in the sociological perspective, because if you did a critical analysis of most of the development interventions, you will realize that let it be climate change, integrated water management, or infrastructure, that all of this is designed for socio-economic challenges to address those challenges. So unless you bring in a social perspective, you're doing everyone a disservice. So now to answer your question, from my experience, water policies often fail because they overlook social realities of water as a whole. Yes. Water, in most cases, is regarded as infrastructure and a resource, but it's just not limited to that. It's our life, it's our daily life, it's livelihood, it's survival. So people who manage it and share resources, these are the same people who resolve conflicts through local norms, trust, and governance structures. So based on that, we should stop looking at it from that perspective, that is from a technical perspective, and expand our view of water. Based on that, access to water and even cooperation is shaped by intersectional factors. Those factors, among others, are gender, the youth, livelihoods, and local power relations, among others. As we know, women carry the biggest burden when it comes to water, of walking long distances to fetch it, and in the process, they are exposed to dangerous situations, and then also sometimes fail to go to school because of time spent in water. And then also we have situations where in most of these circles, youth are not given an opportunity to make decisions. Yes, yet they are one of the population that we should rely on for sustainability. So when you're talking about policies, once they ignore all these intersecting realities, we risk living in a world whereby water is not a priority, because most of the people who really, really matter and the beneficiaries and partners don't get the opportunity to participate in the decision making and also in the formulation of these policies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, dear Prisca. It's true. We need to broaden our horizon and maybe just rethinking the way we see water policy and the new world that now we have to work with. We're halfway through this session. I'm gonna start the next round of questions. I would like you all to think about it 2-3 minutes, not more, but try and frame really a policy message, something you would like directly repeated in the coming 2 days on the specific topic that you're covering. And then we're going to open for discussion and then come back and have sort of a last inspirational final message sort of kind of question. So I'll come back to Marie-Amélie. If the conference were to deliver one non-negotiable commitment on transboundary water data, it could be on transboundary aquifers, one that strengthens accountability and cooperation, what should it be?
Yeah, thank you. So before moving on to the policy part of the response, I'll give a few facts that are really important and that are not as visible in the discussions so far about groundwater. Groundwater is the invisible part of the water cycle, a resource often overlooked, and despite its crucial role in our world, it provides half of our drinking water and often 100% in rural areas, 40% of irrigation water, and a third of industrial water needs, while also supporting ecosystems and sustaining river flows, preventing land subsidence, and marine saltwater intrusion. So groundwater is a key part of the water cycle. It's an invisible resource, but it cannot be considered independently from surface water. They are interconnected and must be considered together in all water management and policy frameworks. Also, about transboundary aquifer, despite 426 identified transboundary aquifers across the world, 426, that's a lot, but it doesn't mean that we know what's going on, the functioning, the groundwater dynamics. We, in most cases, just know that they're there, but only a few of them are governed by international agreements or arrangements. So far fewer than the 600 international agreements governing transboundary surface waters. So countries must take ownership of their transboundary aquifers, including the monitoring, assessment, and management of the resources and funding of same in cooperation with neighboring states. Strengthening political will and establishing effective cooperation mechanisms are essential to ensure the sustainable and peaceful use of these critical resources. So if we go back to the question, if the UNWC 2026 were to deliver a non-negotiable commitment on transboundary water data, what should it be? Well, talking about data, we cannot manage what we don't measure. So monitoring data collection must be undertaken to track groundwater quality, groundwater quantity over time. And it's essential to understand aquifers' functioning and also detect threats like over-abstraction, contamination, or decreasing recharge due to global change, especially. As I said in the first round, monitoring is a long-term effort, costly effort, but a strategic investment. So a binding obligation for riparian states would be to routinely share standardized and timely and quality-controlled transboundary water data through joint or basin-level mechanisms with clear rules on access, verification, and use. Because without a credible evidence-based understanding of the resource, there's no meaningful cooperation. And when we talk about transboundary basins, as I said earlier, let's not forget transboundary groundwater and transboundary surface water. It's river, lakes, wetland. They all interact. And conjunctive water management of surface water and groundwater is essential. So treating this system separately undermines the effective allocation, risk management, and compliance. So to conclude, a non-negotiable commitment on transboundary water data must explicitly require conjunctive monitoring and sharing of surface water and groundwater information. And this measure is essential to strengthen accountability across riparian states. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What concrete policy commitment, such as free, prior, and informed consent, is essential to ensure Indigenous knowledge is protected and used with rights, consent, and equitable benefits rather than extracted?
Thank you, Sogol. I'm very happy that my friend Marie brought the case of aquifers, because let me tell you a short story that it just came in my mind. I'm a Maya woman, and my research has been also on aquifers. And I want to bring here an example, so for you to better understand the importance of these concrete policy commitments and how some commitments might influence how Indigenous peoples relate to water resources as well. So for the Mayas, they flourish in the Yucatan Peninsula, in a place where water was completely scarce. But they were able to thrive as a civilization for more than 3,000 years because of an aquifer, because the groundwater system. But what happened is that in monitoring groundwater systems, the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge is completely absent. But as a Maya woman, I was able to develop the first groundwater balance model, because you cannot measure what you don't know, along with Indigenous peoples. And this was very relevant because all together we developed this model. So this model is currently used for the local government for groundwater management plans. And this information also was included information about how important were those groundwater systems for the Mayas, including the cultural and spiritual connection. So all, not only numerical model, this was a socio-ecological model. So I have some publications if you want to know about it. But, and this is the part of my concrete policy, my suggestion about a concrete policy commitment, which is the free, prior, and informed consent, which is the minimum but most essential policy commitment to protect Indigenous knowledge in water governance. This FPIC is rooted in the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and it ensures that our communities, we voluntarily approve any use of our knowledge with full information, no coercion, and shared decision-making power. So essentially, FPIC requires no manipulation, ample time for deliberation, transparent risk benefits, and true consent. This, excluding FPIC, perpetuates more power imbalances as seen in water diversions, harming Indigenous health and ecosystems worldwide without our consent. So essentially what I wanted to bring here is that it is possible to work together for water monitoring. It's possible to protect the environment, but to work together with Indigenous peoples and some communities, but always respecting their consent, and applying the free, prior, and informed consent form. So there are more other concrete commitments and mechanisms that can be that should be considered, but at least FPIC is the minimum. Thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing that up. Inclusivity is important, but we also have to do no harm and not go about it the wrong way. Isabela, what is this, not talking about sort of accountability now in this space? What single accountability mechanisms, such as reporting requirements or maybe indicators, follow-up processes, should the conference endorse to ensure commitments are translated into implementation and we don't face the same problems after the 2023 UN Water Conference? We had, 800 commitments that we don't know what they were? Please.
I believe that if we want to deliver real change, if the UN Water Conference in this year wants to deliver real change, we must leave behind all these declarations, all these conversations that we have that they look very beautiful on the website, on paper, on this, but we must establish a clear accountability expectation. This is where the previous edition of the conference failed. So my suggestion of this the single most important mechanism is a mandatory standardized post-conference reporting and review framework for all these voluntary commitments that should be aligned with the SDG follow-up process. And this framework, this mechanism should require governments and institutions to report within 12 to 18 months after the conference on actions that were taken to implement their commitments, timelines and milestones, responsible institutions, and progress achieved on the ground. And this reporting should be public accessible, not only on the website, should be like promoted on social media. It should be able to be compared across countries, regions, and institutions, and also linked to national water strategies and all the SDG 6 indicators that have. So this framework, this accountability framework, should be fully consistent to the with the UN language on implementation, monitoring, and review, and consider the principle that commitments, they must be trackable, they must be reviewed, and they must be subject to learning and correction. If you have not achieved something, you need to inform and you need to learn from the process. Because this trust that we have in water governance and management, it is built on decisions that are not only made, but also reviewed and revisited. And this participation that we have been talking in terms of how we can engage other knowledge, it only becomes meaningful when we have a transparency, a follow-up, and the possibility to question whether commitments they are being delivered or not. And without these mechanisms, all these voluntary commitments, they risk remaining political statements, which is what we have with the Water Action Agenda. So with this accountability framework, if it became part of a living accountability cycle that is incorporated and linked to the UN system and linked to the SDG 6, it can support the learning, the enhancement of all the institutions that we have related to the water sector, and of course, like the correction of it. And I see that this is how this conference, this UN Water Conference in this year can shift, can change from the system, from all the ambitions that we have to delivery.
Thank you so much for that. I really like the part you said that we need to learn and be able to correct actually our framework. Sometimes we get so stuck on something we could agree upon that we don't admit that we're going the wrong way. We just keep going. We come to Prisca at a very good moment when we come to questions about governments, and I'd like to welcome representatives of our co-host and government of UAE into the room as well. So if the 2026 UN Water Conference succeeds, if governments truly want public trust, what is one commitment they must make at the conference to ensure communities, especially women, have real influence over water decisions?
That is a good one.
Thank you.
I think if the commitment governments can make, excuse me, repeat the question. Sorry.
Repeat.
Yeah, repeat it.
If governments truly want public trust, what is one commitment they must make to ensure communities, especially women, have real influence over water decisions?
What governments can do is, number one, have a sort of balance in decision making. That is have an inclusive approach to engaging all stakeholders, and in so doing, have a sort of intersectional approach, wearing intersectional lenses, not dealing only with men, but also women, indigenous groups, youth, because just as I always say, even what I said in Austria, I'm sure that in the next 30 to 40 years, all of us in this room will no longer be here. And who do we have to walk in our shoes when we're gone? So it's important to bring all the youth on board, and they should be consulted, not just brought in to observe conferences or just observe such spaces, but actually participate. And then we should I'm going to give an example of Uganda. Yes, we are doing something. We have water user committees right from the grassroots, right from the communities, and these participate actively in managing water sources and dealing with allocation of the different water sources, operation and maintenance. So to an extent, we are already doing it, but unfortunately, it doesn't translate to certain levels, yeah? So I think one of the approaches we can do as a government is to strengthen stakeholder inclusion, but with intersectional lenses. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That is a strong message. Now I would like to open up the room. Any questions for our panelists? Question there.
Hi, raise your hand, raise a question.
There are three.
Hi, thank you. I'm Lilian Coelho from Suez and from different organizations around the world, and a passion from Senegal. And thank you for this impressive presentation about your know-how about hydraulic, about leadership, about the coordination international. And my question is most precisely with Prisca about the social interpretation by the government. All projects that I did best that one was to the social, the civil civility integrates in the project. You need to have this feedback. Then how to be sure that the government can integrate this performance about the society in the real projects. Thank you.
We take one more and then come back.
Bonsoir. Merci à Isabelle de m'avoir permis d'être là aujourd'hui. Merci à vous, chers panélistes. J'aimerais juste poser une question à Madame Isabelle, s'il vous plaît. J'aimerais juste lui demander comment pourrons-nous créer un lien plus direct entre la recherche doctorale en Afrique de l'Ouest et la diplomatie mondiale de l'eau. Parce que nous disposons des données locales et des données de terrain. Donc, comment pourrons-nous garantir que ces expertises deviennent une priorité dans l'agenda international 2026? Merci.
Any other questions? While we give colleagues a moment to reflect. Natasha, please.
Get mics for 20 years. Here we go.
At least you're getting in your step.
Yeah, get my steps.
Hello, my name is Natasha Ramkipal. I'm with the Women in Water Diplomacy Network as a member. My question is for Marie-Amélie. It's more around groundwater data and the availability of it, because a lot of domestic groundwater users are not necessarily regulated or registered, nor is the quality of the groundwater abstraction systems regulated as well. What are some of the policy changes we need to see governments regulating or introducing to ensure that domestic users of this groundwater are actually protected, and that we get the data from geohydrological census into some of the decisions that you're talking about and the policies that you're talking about?
Prisca, you want to go first?
Okay, thank you. If I got the question right, you asked how could we integrate social aspects in projects, right? Now, for the case of Uganda, our ministry has employed sociologists, and we are the main link between the ministry and the communities. What we do, we sensitize communities on social issues, mainstream, gender, HIV, and all those interrelated issues. We also form through the districts, because we work with the community development officers, that is the local structures, to implement this. And what we do, we build their capacity also in this, and through them, the water user committees are our main link in the communities. And what they do, they also maintain and operate the water systems or water sources, and they also ensure that the participation and the inclusion women and men is equal on those communities, yeah, to ensure that gender issues are catered also for. Yes, I think, have I answered your question? Okay. Oh, with the governance, yeah. Yeah, we are not perfect, that's the truth. We are not perfect, we are getting there, but one from experience, political will is very important, because I remember back, I think in 7 to 10 years ago, when our leadership, we had a leadership of only women, and that is when they understand what the burden of water is all about, yeah? And with them in the leadership, they were able to engage our technical people at that level to also mainstream all these intersectional issues into water and environment issues. So I think, I hope I've answered you to an extent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Political will is important, and it's great that I think we have it finally, so we should capitalize on it. Isabela, over to you.
Thank you. I will try to understand because my French is non-existent. So I was counting with the support of the translator. I believe that your inquiry was how we can reach the knowledge that we produced during our research in universities into policy, something more practical. And first, I'd like to start saying that this is a challenge that everyone that is in academia, they face. Everyone that has done a PhD, we face what we do with our research, what is the outcome that we have from it. And talking by my experience on it, we have to translate everything that we produced in this academic environment to a language that our society understands in a way that it's something that is meaningful for them. And why is it that the academic language is because we have the terminology, the specifications on it, and most of the population, they don't have access to the information, they don't understand it. So, and even the ones that are doing the policymakers, they don't understand what we are talking about. So we have to make a way that we can simplify our research in a way that the ones that are being like the targeted audience, the ones that are being benefit from it, they can understand how it is. It can be maybe into a report or a workshop that you carried out in your society, in your neighborhood on this. It can be in different outcomes of it, not just like publications in journals or presenting a paper in a scientific conference, but going to the ground and disseminating the content that you have in a different outcome from it. And it's not an easy task to do it, how to translate it, but it's a challenge that we all face it. Sadly, not everyone has the access to the information that we have of it. And it's almost as our role in our society to make sure that they can understand what we are discussing and how they can benefit from it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Maria-Amélie, over to you.
Yeah. Well, if I understood the question correctly, you were asking about water allocation and domestic groundwater abstraction that is not regulated. Not always, in some part of the world it is, but yeah, it's true that in many parts of the world, illegal drilling is a major issue, and it can cause over abstractions, salinization issues, even subsidence. And also in some part of the world, industries also are not required to report the volume or the quality of the water they use. So I don't have like a perfect recipe, a solution for this. A first part would be for the government to better regulate, is first to have a good understanding of what's going on. So undertaking an inventory of the domestic wells, for example, would be a way forward. And yeah, also establishing like a water allocation system, and also controlling how these domestic wells are drilled, because there's also a safety issue there. And yeah. So yeah, I guess the inventory of the situation is the prerequisite to then form better policy to regulate this domestic wealth. But yeah, it really depends on the context, I guess, too. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm going to go now. We're running out of time. I'm going to go over to Yolanda, and I would like you to answer this question as a member of the Global Leadership Council of Women in Water Diplomacy Network. If the 2026 UN Water Conference succeeds, how will power, knowledge, and trust reshape water governance by after 2030? How would that influence the policy process? But specifically, I want you to tell us, what single message must women water diplomats deliver to global leaders to achieve this?
Okay, thank you. And I'm happy that you asked this, because as a member of the council, it's very important that we all share the same message to the global leaders. One main message from my perspective is inclusivity, because being a woman is, of course, a privilege, but being an indigenous woman or someone living in a rural community brings more challenges. So inclusivity is to include different perspectives that all the different groups of women can bring to the table. And for example, talking about indigenous peoples or indigenous women, for me, it's important to talk to those global leaders and to say that we indigenous peoples, we also have our own science diplomatic practices. And this science diplomacy dates back pre-contact. So I think it's important to recognize that we have our own ways of doing our diplomacy, and this is based on recognition of different knowledge systems, different ways to solve conflicts, for example, and that's the main message from an indigenous perspective, of course.
Thank you so much for that powerful message for all of us to take forward. We have finished on time. I am very proud. I would like to thank my wonderful panelists here and their insights. I think we have enough to go by for a good report out of this session. I thank you all for your attention. My last few seconds of a self-promotion now. So launched a flagship report on global water bankruptcy earlier this week. If you haven't yet, please check it out. And my second hat and promotional item of the day is that the Women in Water Diplomacy Network is mentioned on page 56. So if it's only for that, go check it out. Thank you.